Welcome back to the Deep Dive. It is Tuesday, January 20th, 2026. And I think we can safely say that the world has changed, maybe irrevocably, in just the last 17 days.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of those moments where you can almost feel the tectonic plates of history shifting under your feet. We're living through it.
We really are. I mean, usually when we sit down for one of these, we're looking at, trends that have been building quietly for years or a piece of history that's been gathering dust.
Mm-hmm.
But today, we are right in the thick of it. The dust hasn't even begun to settle. We are talking about Venezuela. And there's really only one place to start. I mean, we have to address the massive military operation in the room.
Operation Absolute Resolve.
Exactly. Just over 2 weeks ago, January 3rd, 2026, the United States military launches this massive strike. And they don't just knock out some infrastructure. They go in and capture President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, and then fly them to New York to face narco-terrorism charges. It sounds like the plot of a thriller movie, but this is the reality we're all waking up to.
It's a massive geopolitical earthquake.
Yeah.
But the mission for us today in this deep dive, it isn't just to, stare at the headlines.
Right.
The headlines are screaming about the raid, the indictment, the immediate reaction. But to understand why Venezuela reached this specific breaking point, why a country with the largest oil reserves on the entire planet,
once the wealthiest in South America.
the wealthiest,
Yeah.
why it ended up in a position where foreign troops are literally extracting its leader at 2 a.m.
Right.
To understand that, you have to go deeper.
You need the context. And we've got a stack of sources here that go way beyond the breaking news. We're looking at demographic data, these fascinating historical archives about German colonization, which I have to admit I did not see coming.
Oh, it's a wild story.
And economic reports that track everything from the price of a cup of coffee to the total collapse of their oil industry.
And when you stack all of that up, you realize that January 3rd wasn't just some random event. It was the culmination of a century of very specific economic and political choices. It's a story about geology, geography, and how a whole society gets warped around a single resource like oil.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start with the immediate crisis, just to ground ourselves in what's happening right now. Take us back to the night of January 3rd. What do the reports say actually went down?
Well, according to the Pentagon reports and some of the on-the-ground sources we've pulled, the operation kicked off around 2:00 a.m. local time. And it was a classic, overwhelming, two-pronged approach. First, you had a pretty significant air campaign.
Bombing infrastructure.
Right. U.S. forces hit military infrastructure all across the northern tip of Venezuela.
And this wasn't just random, right? This had a very specific tactical purpose.
Absolutely. The primary goal there was to suppress air defenses. Venezuela, over the years, had accumulated quite a bit of, Russian-made air defense systems. So the U.S. needed to essentially blind and deafen the Venezuelan military. That way, the extraction team could operate without being shot out of the sky.
So while all that chaos is happening in the air, while their radar screens are going dark, you have the apprehension force moving on the ground.
Precisely. They went straight for Maduro's compound in Caracas. And I think it's important to stress, this wasn't a walk in the park. This wasn't some bloodless coup or a polite knock on the door. There was real resistance.
And getting accurate numbers in that kind of situation is always tough.
The fog of war is real, and our sources show that conflict pretty clearly. The numbers vary depending on who you ask.
What are they saying?
Venezuelan officials, or what was left of the command structure, they initially claimed about 23 of their security officers were killed. But other independent sources, some intelligence leaks, they suggest the number is much higher, maybe up to 47 soldiers. There were also, tragically, reports of civilian casualties in the surrounding areas, which is it's inherent to that kind of urban warfare. But there's one specific detail in the casualty report that really stands out.
The Cubans.
Yes. The reports we have indicate that 32 members of the Cuban military were killed in the firefight at the compound.
That adds a whole other layer to this. It confirms what people have suspected for years, that the Cuban presence wasn't just, advisory. They were the Praetorian Guard.
They were the inner circle of security. It basically validates years of intelligence saying that Havana was deeply, deeply embedded in the security apparatus of the Maduro regime.
But the end result, firefight or not, was Maduro and Flores in U.S. custody.
In custody, and just 2 days later, January 5th, they are standing in a federal courtroom in Manhattan,
pleading not guilty to narco-terrorism charges. And that specific charge, narco-terrorism, that's really important, isn't it?
It's the whole justification. We'll get into this more when we talk about the economy. But the U.S. framing here is rooted in this idea that the Venezuelan state under Maduro had stopped being a political entity and had become a criminal enterprise.
A drug trafficking one specifically.
Exactly. So it frames the intervention not as regime change for political reasons, but as a massive law enforcement action. Now, whether the rest of the world buys that distinction is another story entirely.
And back in Caracas, you have a massive power vacuum. But it didn't stay empty for very long.
No, it didn't. Delcy Rodríguez was sworn in as acting president on January 5th. This surprised some people who thought the whole structure would just instantly crumble.
Right.
But the Chavista party machine, it runs deep. So even with this decapitation strike, the structure of the government hasn't completely dissolved. It's hanging on. It's a very fragile continuity.
Meanwhile, the rhetoric coming out of Washington has been, well, confusing to say the least.
That's a good word for it.
It feels like the messaging hasn't been fully coordinated. You have President Trump on one hand stating that the U.S. intends to run Venezuela until a transition happens. And he explicitly mentioned access to oil.
Which is a statement that just echoes through the history of Latin America.
Yeah.
And it confirms everything critics of U.S. foreign policy have been saying for decades, that at the end of the day, it's always about the resources.
Then, almost immediately, you have Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, trying to walk that back. He's out there saying, no, we're not going to run the country, and emphasizing a transition to local control.
It just signals a chaotic policy environment in Washington.
Yeah.
And that creates even more uncertainty on the ground in Caracas. If you're a Venezuelan citizen, you have no idea if you're being occupied, liberated, or something totally different.
And the international reaction reflects that split, right?
Completely polarized. You have the UN, Russia, China, Mexico, all condemning the act as a gross violation of sovereignty. But then you see videos from the diaspora Venezuelans in Miami, in Madrid, in Bogota, and they're celebrating in the streets. It's a very complex emotional landscape.
There was one strategic move, though, that happened almost immediately that I found really fascinating: the release of political prisoners.
Yes, this was almost certainly a calculated move by Delcy Rodríguez and the leadership that was left. They were trying to lower the temperature.
How many are we talking about?
We have confirmed reports of 139 political prisoners being released almost immediately after the strike.
That's a lot of people.
It is. And the analysis here is that this was a way to prevent a second wave of U.S. attacks. It was the remaining government basically saying, look, we're cooperating, we're opening the jails, please don't bomb us again. It's a desperate game of survival.
It really is. But to understand why the country is so vulnerable, why the institutions just crumbled so easily, and why the U.S. felt it could or, needed to intervene, we have to look at what Venezuela actually is. Because I think for a lot of people, Venezuela is just a headline about socialism or oil. But the history of the place, the land of grace, as they called it, it's wild.
It is. And honestly, to understand the economics of 2026, you have to understand the genetics and the colonization of the 1500s. It all starts with the name itself. We've all heard the story that Venezuela means Little Venice.
Right. The story goes that Amerigo Vespucci sails in, he sees the indigenous stilt houses, the palafitos out on Lake Maracaibo, and it reminds him of Venice.
Exactly. So he calls it Venezuela, Little Venice. But what most people don't know, and this is where the history gets really surprising, is that for a big chunk of the 16th century, Venezuela wasn't really a Spanish colony. It was German.
Wait, German? I definitely missed that chapter in history class.
Yes. From 1528 to 1546, the territory was known as Klein Venedig, Little Venice, but in German.
How on earth did that happen?
It's a story as old as time. Debt. King Charles V of Spain, who was also the Holy Roman Emperor, owed a massive amount of money to the Welser banking family from Augsburg.
Okay.
He had borrowed heavily to basically buy the votes he needed to become emperor in the first place. He was leveraged up to his eyeballs.
So he couldn't pay them back in cash?
He couldn't. So he did the next best thing. He essentially leased them the entire province of Venezuela. He gave the Welser family the rights to exploit the territory to recoup their money.
That is it's unbelievable. So the country began its colonial history not as a place for people to live, but as a collateral asset, a debt repayment plan.
Precisely. And that distinction matters. The German governors, guys like Ambrosius Egger and Nicholas Federman, they weren't there primarily to build a society or spread religion. They were there to find El Dorado.
The city of gold.
The city of gold. They were explorers, but really they were extractors. They founded cities like Maracaibo, sure, but their primary drive was profit extraction to pay off a debt on a ledger back in Europe.
And when you look at the last 20 years of Venezuelan history, with its massive debts to China and Russia and the extraction of gold and oil to pay those debts, I mean, the echoes of history are deafening.
It's a haunting parallel. It's like this rentier mindset. The idea that the land exists to pay for something else was baked into the country's DNA from the very beginning.
Let's talk about the people, though, because despite this history of extraction, the population that formed there became something incredibly diverse.
A true melting pot.
Yeah.
The genetic breakdown from our data is fascinating. You have roughly 51.6% of the population identifying as multiracial or mestizo, about 43.6% white, 3.6% black, and around 2% indigenous.
But those broad categories hide some really specific cultural stories. For instance, I saw in the notes you mentioned Venezuela being called the eighth island.
I did. The eighth island of what, do you think?
I have no idea.
The Canary Islands.
Really?
The migration from the Canary Islands to Venezuela was so massive and so sustained over centuries that it culturally transformed the country. The Venezuelan accent, for instance, the way they tend to aspirate, dissess, or cut off the ends of words, that's heavily influenced by the Canarian dialect. The food, the customs, so much of what the world thinks of as Venezuelan has deep roots in the Canary Islands.
And it wasn't just them, right? After World War II, Venezuela was a magnet for the whole world.
A massive magnet. You have to remember, in the 1950s, Europe was in ruins. Venezuela was absolutely booming. Between 1948 and 1961, something like 900,000 Europeans moved to Venezuela.
Wow.
Italians, Spanish, Portuguese. They were fleeing a devastated continent and coming to what they saw as the land of the future. It's the American dream, but it was happening in South America.
Which makes the contrast with today just so heartbreaking. We've gone from receiving nearly 1 million immigrants to seeing, what is it now, over 7 million people flee the country.
Over 7 million. That's about 20% of the entire population. Can you imagine if 20% of the U.S. population just left over the course of a decade? That would be over 60 million people.
It's a demographic collapse.
It is. We went from being a destination for hope to a source of refugees.
Mm-hmm.
And that brain drain, that loss of human capital, all the doctors, the engineers, the teachers, that's a wound that will take generations to heal.
And looking at the geography, where were all these people living? Because the country is huge, but when you look at the map, everyone seems squeezed into one small area.
That's the great geographic inequality of Venezuela. It's a megadiverse country. I mean, you have the Andes Mountains with snow in the west, you have the Caribbean coast in the north, the Amazon rainforest in the south, the Orinoco Delta in the east. It has everything.
But the people don't live everywhere.
No. 85% of the population lives in that northern coastal strip.
So Caracas, Maracaibo, Valencia, all the big hubs are just hugging the sea.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the entire southern half of the country, basically everything south of the Orinoco River, holds only 5% of the population.
That's where all the massive national parks are, right?
Yes. Over 21% of the entire territory is protected land. You have Canima National Park, which is the size of Belgium, home to Angel Falls. But that emptiness in the south has become a huge problem.
How so?
Because the state's presence there is so weak, it's become a playground for illegal gold mining, for guerrilla groups. It's effectively lawless territory.
Okay, so we have this demographic collapse, this geographic divide, and this history of foreign debt. But we can't talk about Venezuela without talking about the one thing that connects it all. The devil's excrement, as the founder of OPEC famously called it.
Oil.
Oil.
The oil curse. It is the single most defining factor of modern Venezuela, and you have to wrap your head around the scale of it. Venezuela possesses the largest proven oil reserves in the world.
Not Saudi Arabia.
Not Saudi Arabia. Venezuela. 302.81 billion barrels.
There was a time when that made them rich, like unbelievably rich.
Incredibly rich. In the 1950s, Venezuela's real GDP per capita was on par with West Germany. It was higher than Ireland's. It was by far the wealthiest nation in all of Latin America.
They built huge infrastructure projects.
Massive ones. The General Rafael Urdaneta Bridge over Lake Maracaibo, huge highway systems, incredible universities. The Concorde used to fly to Caracas because there was just that much money there.
But all that wealth created a trap, the rentier estate concept.
Exactly. A rentier state is an economy that relies on rent income from foreign sources, like selling oil instead of on domestic production. When you can make that much money just by pumping something out of the ground, you stop making other things.
You stop farming because it's cheaper to just import food.
You stop manufacturing because you can just buy cars from Japan or the U.S. The entire economy becomes a one-legged stool.
And that one leg is 95% of your exports.
So when oil is $100 a barrel, everyone's having a party. But when the price of oil drops, The party ends, and you suddenly realize you've sold off the furniture in the kitchen sink to pay for the champagne.
And that's exactly what happened. Between 2013 and 2026, the GDP fell by 80%.
80%.
That number is, just for context, during the Great Depression in the U.S., the economy contracted by about 30%.
Correct. So this is an economic collapse almost without precedent in a country not in an open, all-out war. It is a complete and total implosion. And it brought with it the kind of hyperinflation we've all read about.
The Café con Leche Index. I saw this in the notes and I thought it was a joke at first, but it's a real economic metric.
It's a visceral way to understand inflation when the official government statistics become, completely unreliable. Bloomberg started literally just tracking the price of a cup of coffee in eastern Caracas.
And what did they find?
At one point, the price of that single cup of coffee increased 718% in just 12 weeks.
718%
Yeah.
in 3 months.
If you annualize that rate, it was something like 448,000%.
It's almost funny in this dark, absurd way, but just think about living through that. You get paid on Friday, and by the time you walk to the market, your money has literally lost value. You have to spend everything the second you get it.
It destroys the very fabric of society. It destroys the concept of savings, of planning for the future. By 2024, 82% of Venezuelans were living in poverty. 53% were in extreme poverty.
These were people who were middle class.
Professors, doctors, engineers, suddenly unable to buy food for their families. There were reports of people rummaging through trash to eat.
But wait, the report does mention that in 2023, there was a slight growth, right? The so-called Chevron dollars.
Yes, there was a tiny rebound, about 15% growth from the absolute rock bottom. This was because the government implicitly allowed dollarization.
They gave up on their own currency.
They realized the Bolivar was effectively dead, so they just looked the other way and let people use U.S. dollars. And they allowed Chevron to pump a little bit of oil again just to get some cash flowing.
But this created a brutal new kind of inequality.
The most unequal in the entire region. If you had access to dollars, maybe you worked remotely for a foreign company, or you had a relative in Miami sending you money, you were okay. You could go to the store. But if you were a state employee, a teacher, a nurse, paid in worthless bolivars, you were starving.
And the numbers showed that.
The wealthy were making 70 times what the poor were making. It was a two-tiered society.
And underneath all of this, beneath the official broken economy, there was this massive shadow economy that was growing.
And this brings us right back to the charges against Maduro. As the oil industry collapsed from mismanagement and sanctions, the state still needed revenue to survive. They couldn't tax the people because the people were broke. So where do you go?
Crime.
State-sponsored illicit activity. Our sources indicate that by 2022, illegal activities, we're talking drug trafficking, gold smuggling, fuel smuggling, made up about 21% of the entire GDP.
A fifth of the country's economy was criminal.
Correct. Down in the south, in that mining arc we talked about, you have these wildcat gold mines. It's an ecological catastrophe, poisoning rivers with mercury, but it generates billions of dollars in gold. And much of that bypassed the official treasury completely.
It went where?
Into the pockets of the military generals and the political elite to keep them loyal to the regime.
So when the U.S. Department of Justice indicts Maduro for narco-terrorism, they aren't just saying he turned a blind eye to it. They're arguing that the government itself became a cartel to survive the economic collapse.
That's the argument, the cartel of the suns. It's the fusion of the state and organized crime.
It's just staggering. How do you govern a country like that? Well, I guess the answer is you become a strong man. And Venezuela has a very, very long history of those. It did not start with Maduro.
No, the caudillo tradition, the military strongman, is deep in the DNA of Venezuelan politics.
Let's go back to the classic one mentioned in the archives, Juan Vicente Gómez, the tyrant of the Andes.
He ruled from 1908 to 1935. He is the absolute archetype. He was a cattle rancher from the Andes who basically treated the entire country like his personal farm. He was brutal, he had a secret police, he suppressed all opposition, the prisons were full, but...
There's always a but.
But he paid off all the country's foreign debts, he brought stability, and crucially, he oversaw the birth of the oil industry. The great 1922 oil strike happened under his watch. He gave the concessions to the Americans and the British, he took the royalties, and he used that money to consolidate absolute power.
So order at the cost of freedom.
A very common trade-off in Venezuelan history. Then you jump forward to the 1950s, you have Marcos Pérez Jiménez, another military dictator.
But he built a lot.
He did. If you look at photos of Caracas from the 50s, the futuristic architecture, the Hotel Humboldt on the mountaintop, the massive highways, he built all of that. The GDP was soaring. But again, the torture chambers of his national security police were always full.
And then, in 1958, they tried democracy, the Punto Fijo Pact.
This was a fascinating experiment. After Pérez Jiménez was finally overthrown, the main political parties got together and said, we can't keep doing this. We can't keep having coups. So they signed a pact.
An agreement to what?
To respect election results, to share power, to basically keep the military in the barracks and out of politics.
And for a while, it actually worked.
For 40 years, Venezuela was the most stable democracy in South America. While Chile and Argentina and Brazil were suffering under these brutal military juntas in the 70s, Venezuela was holding elections. It was a beacon of stability.
But it was a beacon that was fueled by oil money.
Exactly. The pact worked as long as there was enough oil money to pass around to everybody. But when the oil market crashed in the 1980s, the money stopped. The corruption, which had always been there, suddenly became visible. The inequality just skyrocketed.
And that leads us to the moment it all started to unravel, the Caracazo.
February 27, 1989. This event is the seed of the entire Bolivarian Revolution.
And it started over something so small, bus fares.
The government, under pressure from the IMF, had to raise gas prices. This caused a 30% hike in bus fares. It seemed small, but people were already stretched to the absolute breaking point. It was the final straw.
And it triggered massive riots.
Riots and looting across Caracas. The poor came pouring down from the slums in the hills. And the government, they panicked.
They sent the army in?
They suspended constitutional rights and ordered the military to restore order.
Yeah.
And the soldiers fired on their own people. Hundreds, maybe thousands of civilians died. We still don't have a real number.
And watching all of this was a young lieutenant colonel named Hugo Chávez.
Exactly. For him, the Caracazo broke the social contract. It proved the democratic system was morally bankrupt. So in 1992, he tried to overthrow that same government in a coup.
It failed militarily, but he won the PR war, didn't he?
He did. When he was captured, they gave him 1 minute on national television to tell his followers to surrender. And he famously said, "Comrades, our objectives have not been achieved. Por ahora." That, for now, became a promise. It turned him from a failed coup leader into a folk hero overnight. He was jailed, but then pardoned. And he swept into power in the 1998 election, completely burying the old political parties. This is the start of the Bolivarian Revolution.
And initially, we have to be honest, he was incredibly popular.
He was, and he was incredibly lucky. I know I sound like a broken record, but oil prices skyrocketed in the early 2000s. He had trillions of dollars pouring in.
And he spent it?
He poured it into social missions literacy programs, healthcare clinics in the slums, staffed by Cuban doctors. And poverty actually dropped significantly in those early years. For the first time, the poor majority felt like they had a president who saw them.
But then came the overreach. Lo Presidente.
His weekly Sunday TV show, it was a spectacle. He would walk through the city, point at a building, maybe a historic jewelry center or a glass factory, and just say on live television, expropriated.
Who's like that on TV?
On live TV. He took over farms, factories, entire industries. The idea was to give them to the people. But the reality was he gave them to political loyalists who didn't know how to run them. A productive farm would become a wasteland. A steel mill would stop producing steel. They systematically destroyed the productive capacity of the country.
So they were burning the furniture to keep the house warm.
And then the oil price crashed again, and Chávez died. And a much less charismatic Nicolás Maduro was left holding the bag.
Maduro takes over in 2013, right as this whole economic house of cards is collapsing.
Exactly. He didn't have Chávez's charisma, and more importantly, he didn't have the money. So when people got hungry and started protesting, he couldn't charm them or buy them off with social programs. He turned to pure repression.
The 2017 protests, the move to create a new constituent assembly.
The 2017 protests were months of brutal street conflict. Then you had the 2019 crisis, where the head of the National Assembly, Juan Guaidó, declared himself interim president. Do you remember that?
I do. It felt like the whole world was watching. 60 countries recognized Guaidó as the legitimate president.
Looked like the end for Maduro. But he survived. He held on. And he held on because the military stuck with him.
Why?
Because, as we discussed, he gave them the keys to the kingdom, the shadow economy. He let them control the gold mines, the ports, the borders. Their loyalty was bought and paid for with illicit revenue.
Which brings us right back to January 3rd, 2026. Operation Absolute Resolve wasn't just about capturing a president. It was about the U.S. deciding to dismantle a system that it viewed as a direct threat, a narco-state right in the Caribbean basin.
Exactly. The U.S. calculation seems to have been that sanctions weren't working, diplomacy was dead, and this criminal enterprise was only growing. So they took the hard power option.
So here we are. Maduro is in a jail cell in New York. Delcy Rodríguez is trying to hold the government together in Caracas. The U.S. says it wants to run things, then it says it doesn't. It feels like we are at a massive, massive turning point.
We absolutely are. And I want to connect this back to something we touched on earlier, this idea of the cycles of history. Because history in Venezuela, it's not a straight line. It really feels like a circle.
How so?
Okay, look at the year 1902, the Venezuelan crisis. European powers, Britain, Germany, Italy, sent their navies to blockade the Venezuelan coast. Why? Because the government wasn't paying its debts. They actually bombed the port of Puerto Cabello.
And here we are, over a century later, and a foreign power is bombing the coast again.
It's the same story. In the 16th century, German bankers are running the country to extract wealth to pay off a debt. In the 20th century, American and British oil companies exert massive political influence. Now in 2026, the U.S. military has physically removed the head of state to secure, well, stability, justice, or perhaps oil, depending on who you ask.
It really highlights the fundamental vulnerability of the rentier state. When your wealth comes from something in the ground, outsiders will always want a piece of it, and you become completely dependent on their markets to survive.
And when you fail to build a robust, diversified society on top of that wealth, when you keep relying on the next strong man to fix everything, you end up incredibly fragile. Gomez, Perez Jimenez, Chávez, Maduro, they all promise strength. And they all built systems that couldn't survive without them, or without $100 a barrel oil.
So what does this all mean for the person listening to us right now? Why does this matter beyond the headlines?
It matters because Venezuela is a warning. It's a profound warning about what happens when institutions are allowed to erode. It shows you just how quickly a wealthy, modern, educated society can unravel if the economic foundations are rotten. We tend to think progress is permanent, but Venezuela proves it can be reversed in a single generation.
And the human cost is it's off the chart.
It's a tragedy of historic proportions. Those 7 million refugees, they are our neighbors now in Colombia, in Peru, in the United States. This crisis has been spilling over its borders for a decade. The intervention on January 3rd isn't the end of the story. It's just a new and very, very volatile chapter.
And there's still that lingering question about what comes next. What happens now?
That's the billion-dollar question. You have a transitional government under Delcy Rodríguez, but it's operating under the shadow of what is essentially a U.S. occupation. The stated goal is a return to democracy. But let's be real. You have a country where the official economy has shrunk by 80%. You have a generation of children who have grown up with malnutrition. You have armed criminal groups controlling the gold mines in the south.
It is not exactly a turnkey renovation project.
Not at all. And this is the provocative thought I want to leave you with. We tend to see this intervention as a reset, a chance to finally fix things. But in a country where 21% of the GDP was illegal activity, the state and organized crime had become the same thing. By removing the head, have we actually killed the body?
Or have we just created a power vacuum for something worse to fill?
Exactly. Is this violent reset going to lead to a stable recovery? Or is he going to shatter the country and return Venezuela to the chaos of the 19th century, a land of competing warlords, regional fragmentation, and constant conflict instead of a unified nation?
Is it a path to recovery or a return to the colonial habits of the past? That really is the question hanging over the entire country.
It is the question, and for the Venezuelan people, the answer is a matter of life and death.
We will be watching this story very closely as it develops. It's a heavy topic, but a crucial one. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Venezuela. Stay curious, check the show notes for links to those archives, and we'll see you next time.